When he came into my life, everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and desire was shattered in an instant. What happens when the lines between right and wrong blur, and the heart craves what it shouldn't? This isn't just a story of infidelity. It's a ticking time bomb of passion, betrayal, and choices that could change everything. Stick around to find out how it all unravels. And before we dive into this emotional roller coaster, make sure to subscribe for more captivating stories like this one. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. When he came in through the front door that day, I felt my entire world shift in an instant. It wasn't the way he looked at me. No, it was something deeper, something unspoken yet electric. My hands trembled as I placed the glass of water on the counter, his eyes never leaving mine. I knew I should have looked away, but I couldn't. Something inside me craved the attention he gave me, the kind that had been missing for far too long. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. My husband was out of town again, as he so often was, leaving me alone to my thoughts and a restless heart. The weight of loneliness pressed against my chest, a familiar ache that I had grown accustomed to ignoring. But this time it was different. He wasn't supposed to be here, yet here he stood, his presence filling the room with a tension so thick it was almost suffocating. "Am I interrupting?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, sending a ripple of something dangerous down my spine. I forced a laugh, one that sounded hollow even to me. "Not at all," I replied, though my words felt like a lie. I clutched the edge of the counter, grounding myself against the storm brewing inside me. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I thought I'd drop by," he said, stepping closer. The space between us seemed to shrink, the air growing heavier with each passing second. "I figured you could use the company." Company. That word felt like a lifeline and a trap all at once. For months, I had been drowning in the monotony of my marriage, the emotional distance between my husband and me growing wider with every business trip and every night he spent glued to his phone instead of looking at me. And now here was someone who saw me, truly saw me. It was intoxicating. I should have told him to leave. I should have said it was inappropriate, that my husband wouldn't appreciate it. But the words caught in my throat, strangled by the desire to stay in this moment just a little longer. "You're quiet," he observed, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "Something on your mind?" "Yeah." I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. "No, just surprised to see you here. I couldn't stay away," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. My breath hitched. Those words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and I realized then that I was standing on a precipice. One wrong move, one reckless step, and everything I thought I knew about myself could come crashing down. The sound of his footsteps echoed as he walked closer, his shadow falling over me like a storm cloud. When he reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face, I froze. Time seemed to stop, the only sound my pounding heartbeat as the room spun around me. "Tell me to leave," he said softly, his hand lingering by my cheek. But I didn't. I couldn't. What I felt tonight was so much more than just the love we shared that night. And that was the moment everything changed. The moment lingered like a delicate thread about to snap. His hand hovered near my cheek, close enough for me to feel its warmth. I should have told him to leave, but instead I found myself frozen, held captive by the intensity of his gaze. The world outside seemed to fade into a hazy backdrop, leaving only the two of us in this dangerous, magnetic silence. He took a step back, giving me space I hadn't even realized I desperately needed. "Sorry," he said, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean to." "No, it's fine," I interrupted, my words spilling out in a rush. I turned away, busying myself with rearranging items on the countertop to avoid looking at him. "I just wasn't expecting anyone, that's all." He lingered for a moment longer, and I could feel the weight of his hesitation. Then, finally, he moved toward the living room, the familiar creak of the floorboards under his feet grounding me back to reality. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the unsettling mix of emotions swirling inside me. It wasn't the first time he had come over. Mike, my husband's younger brother, had always been around, helping with odd jobs around the house or dropping by unannounced to check in while my husband was away. But lately, his visits had taken on a different tone, one I couldn't quite define. His compliments lingered longer than necessary. His glances held something unspoken, and the air between us felt charged in a way I knew was dangerous. I grabbed a dish towel and wiped my hands, the mundane action giving me a moment to collect myself. When I walked into the living room, Mike was sitting on the couch, his long legs stretched out in front of him, looking far too comfortable. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his t-shirt clung to him in a way that made it hard to ignore the definition of his chest. I mentally scolded myself for noticing. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, breaking the silence. He looked up at me, his eyes soft but searching. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. With Sam gone so much lately, I thought you might be lonely." The words hit a nerve. Lonely. It was an ugly truth I didn't want to admit, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of my carefully constructed life. Sam, my husband, was a good man, a provider, a partner, but he wasn't present, not really. His career had taken over his life, and somewhere along the way, I had become an afterthought, a fixture in the background of his ambitions. "I'm fine," I replied, forcing a smile. "Really, you don't need to worry about me." Mike tilted his head, studying me with an expression that made me feel exposed, like he could see right through the mask I was trying so hard to wear. "You don't have to pretend with me, you know." "Pretend?" I laughed, the sound brittle and hollow. "I'm not pretending anything." He didn't press the issue, but his silence said more than words ever could. He leaned back against the couch, his arms spread casually along the top of the cushions. The posture was relaxed, but there was a tension in his body that betrayed him. "So, how's work?" I asked, desperate to steer the conversation into safer waters. "It's fine," he said, shrugging. "Busy, but not as bad as Sam's schedule, I'm sure." There it was again, the subtle jab that hinted at something more. Mike had always been protective of me, even before Sam and I got married, but lately his concern had taken on a new edge. It felt less like sibling-in-law camaraderie and more like something he wasn't supposed to feel. We talked for a while, keeping the conversation light and impersonal, but the undercurrent of tension never really went away. When Mike finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the door, turning back to face me. "You deserve more, you know," he said, his voice low and serious. "More?" I echoed, my heart skipping a beat. "Yeah, someone who sees you, who's here for you." He hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "Anyway, I'll see you later." And with that, he was gone, leaving me standing in the doorway with a whirlwind of emotions I didn't know how to process. His words lingered long after he left, echoing in my mind as I went about my evening routine. The next few days passed uneventfully, or at least they should have. But I couldn't stop thinking about Mike, his words, his presence, the way he looked at me like I was someone worth noticing. It wasn't right, I knew that. He was my husband's brother, for God's sake. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more they crept in, unbidden and persistent. Sam called late one evening, his voice distant and distracted as usual. "I'll have to extend the trip by a few days," he said. "The client wants more time to go over the proposal." "Of course," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Do what you need to do." "Thanks, babe. You're the best." He hung up before I could even say goodbye. I stared at my phone, the silence in the house pressing down on me like a weight. This was my life now, waiting for him to come home, filling the void with meaningless tasks and polite conversations with neighbors. And then there was Mike, the only person who seemed to notice that I was more than just Sam's wife. Later that week he came by again, this time under the guise of dropping off some tools Sam had asked for. He was casual, friendly even, but there was an undercurrent to his actions that made my pulse race. When he handed me the toolbox, his fingers brushed mine, lingering just a second too long. I pulled my hand away quickly, pretending not to notice. "Do you want to stay for coffee?" I asked, surprising even myself with the invitation. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I was ready to offer. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'd like that." Anchor awareness. We sat at the kitchen table, the conversation flowing more easily this time. We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of effortless connection that felt like a balm to my soul. For the first time in months, I felt seen, heard, understood. When Mike stood to leave, he paused again at the door, just like before. "If you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. As the door clicked shut behind him, I realized I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't take back. As the days passed, Mike's visits became more frequent. Each time he came by, the tension between us grew heavier, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I told myself it was harmless. After all, he was just checking in, making sure I wasn't lonely while Sam was away. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the full truth. There was something unsaid between us, something neither of us dared to acknowledge. One rainy afternoon, I was in the garden trying to salvage some herbs before the storm hit, when I heard the familiar sound of Mike's truck pulling into the driveway. I straightened, wiping my hands on my jeans, as he got out and jogged toward me, his hair damp from the drizzle. "You're going to get soaked out here," he said, grabbing a tarp from his truck bed and helping me cover the plants. His movements were efficient, his hands brushing against mine as we secured the corners. "I didn't want them to get ruined," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. The rain was light, but the atmosphere between us felt thick, like the air before a downpour. Once the plants were covered, we stood there for a moment, side by side, watching the storm roll in. The clouds were a dark gray, casting a shadow over the yard. Mike turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Why do you do this to yourself?" he asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. I blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "You keep waiting for him, hoping he'll change, hoping he'll put you first." His gaze bore into mine, raw and unflinching. "Don't you think you deserve more than this?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth of his statement hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been waiting for Sam to notice me, to make me feel like I mattered. And in the process, I had lost sight of who I was. It's not that simple, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. It could be, Mike said, stepping closer. I could feel the heat radiating from him despite the cool rain. You just have to let it be. The rain started falling harder, soaking through my clothes and plastering my hair to my face. Mike reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from my cheek. His touch was gentle, yet it sent a jolt through me, igniting something I had tried so hard to suppress. Mike, I began, but he shook his head, cutting me off. Tell me to leave, he said, echoing the words from before. His voice was low, almost pleading. Tell me to go, and I will. But if you don't. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The logical part of me screamed to end this, to put distance between us before it was too late. But the other part, the part that craved connection and intimacy, refused to let him go. Instead of answering, I turned and walked back toward the house. I could hear his footsteps behind me, hesitant at first, but growing more confident with each step. By the time I reached the door, he was right behind me, his presence as undeniable as the storm raging outside. Inside, the silence was deafening. I stood in the kitchen, my back to him, trying to steady my breathing. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the counter, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. You don't have to do this, he said softly, his voice breaking the silence, but there was no conviction in his words, only a faint hope that I might make the right choice. I turned to face him, and the look in his eyes unraveled me completely. There was desire there, yes, but also something deeper. Something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us, my lips crashing against his in a kiss that was as desperate as it was inevitable. He responded immediately, his hands tangling in my hair as he pulled me closer. The kiss was everything I had been missing. Passion, connection, the feeling of being wanted. It was a stark contrast to the polite pecks and obligatory affection I had grown used to with Sam. For the first time in years, I felt alive. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing heavily, reality came rushing back like a tidal wave. I took a step back, my fingers brushing against my swollen lips as I tried to process what had just happened. This is wrong, I whispered, more to myself than to him. It doesn't feel wrong, Mike countered, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his eyes. It feels like it's what was supposed to happen. I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. Sam is your brother. This can't happen. But it already has, he said, his voice soft but firm, and you can't deny that it meant something. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I couldn't. That kiss had been more real than anything I had experienced in years, and that terrified me. I need time, I said finally, my voice trembling. I need to think. Mike nodded, stepping back to give me space. Take all the time you need, he said, but just know I'll be here whenever you're ready. And with that, he left, leaving me alone in the quiet house, with nothing but my racing thoughts and the sound of the rain pounding against the windows. The song's low. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mike's face, felt the weight of his hands on me, heard the conviction in his voice when he said I deserved more. The guilt gnawed at me, but so did the longing. When Sam called the next morning, his voice cheerful and oblivious, the weight of my betrayal pressed down on me like a lead blanket. I answered his questions mechanically, forcing a smile into my voice even as my chest ached with the weight of what I had done. As soon as the call ended, I sat down at the kitchen table, my head in my hands. What had I done? What was I doing? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. But no matter how much I tried to reason with myself, one thought remained constant. I didn't regret the kiss. Not one bit. The next few days were an agonizing blur of guilt and desire. Every time I thought about the kiss, my chest tightened, a storm of emotions swirling within me. Guilt for betraying Sam, yes, but also an undeniable craving for the connection I had felt with Mike. It was as if I had awoken from a long, dull slumber, and now everything felt sharper, brighter, more alive. After the fire, Mike drove rapidly to the scene. Sam called daily, his conversations the same predictable pattern of work updates and casual check-ins. I found myself resenting his obliviousness, the way he didn't notice the growing distance between us. He was so consumed by his career that he couldn't see the cracks forming in our marriage. Or maybe he chose not to see them. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Mike stayed away for a while, giving me the space I had asked for. But his absence only made his presence more potent in my mind. I replayed the kiss over and over, the memory seared into my thoughts like a brand. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment fueled by loneliness and vulnerability. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. It had been more than that. It had been real. When Mike finally came by again, it was on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The sun was streaming through the windows, casting golden light across the living room as I folded laundry. The knock on the door startled me, my heart leaping into my throat. I knew it was him before I even opened it. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and cautious. He stood on the porch, his hands stuffed into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, my hand gripping the doorknob. I knew I should say no, should send him away before we spiraled further into something we couldn't come back from. But instead, I stepped aside, allowing him in. The tension was palpable as we stood in the living room, the distance between us feeling like a chasm and a thread at the same time. Mike broke the silence first. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't regret it, not for a second." His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing away the thin veneer of denial I had been clinging to. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Mike, Why not?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Because it's messy? Because it's complicated? Life is messy, and so are feelings. But that doesn't mean they're wrong." "It's not just messy," I said, my voice trembling. "It's wrong. Sam is your brother. And he doesn't see you." Mike shot back, his frustration evident. "He doesn't appreciate you. You deserve more than this, and you know it." His words cut deep because they were true. I had spent years trying to convince myself that Sam's neglect was just a phase, that things would get better, but they hadn't. And now, standing here with Mike, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. "This isn't about what I deserve," I said, my voice cracking. Mike sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sometimes the lines between right and wrong aren't as clear as we'd like them to be. All I know is that I care about you, and I think you care about me too." I didn't respond, but my silence was answer enough. The air between us was charged, the unspoken tension pulling us closer. Mike reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt that familiar jolt, the electricity that had ignited everything. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us, our lips meeting in a kiss that was just as desperate as the first. It was a collision of emotions, passion, longing, guilt, and need, all tangled together in a chaotic storm. For a moment, everything else faded away, leaving only the two of us in this dangerous, intoxicating connection. When we finally broke apart, I stepped back, my breath ragged and my heart racing. "This is insane," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe," Mike said, his voice low, "but it's real." In the weeks that followed, the lines between right and wrong blurred even further. Mike and I found ourselves drawn to each other like moths to a flame, unable to resist the pull despite the consequences. We stole moments whenever we could. Late-night conversations, lingering touches, stolen kisses in the shadows. It was reckless and exhilarating, a secret that bound us together even as it threatened to tear everything apart. But the guilt weighed heavily on me, a constant reminder of the betrayal I was committing. Every time I looked at Sam's face, I felt a pang of shame that twisted my stomach into knots. He didn't suspect a thing, his trust in me unshaken despite my deceit. It made the betrayal all the more unbearable. One evening, as Sam and I sat at the dinner table, his phone buzzed with yet another work notification. He barely glanced up, his attention fixed on the screen as I picked at my food. The silence between us was deafening, the gulf between us wider than ever. "You've been quiet lately," he said suddenly, his eyes finally meeting mine. "Is everything okay?" I froze, caught off guard by the question. For a moment I considered telling him the truth, laying everything bare, but the thought of the devastation it would cause stopped me. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just tired." He nodded, accepting my answer without question, and returned his attention to his phone. The conversation ended as quickly as it began, leaving me with a hollow ache in my chest. Later that night, as I lay awake in bed, I thought about Mike and the tangled web we had woven. I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. Sooner or later, something had to give. The next time I saw Mike, the weight of our actions hung heavy in the air. We met at the park, away from prying eyes and familiar faces. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees as we sat on a bench, side by side but not touching. As we waited for the bell to ring, Mike sat behind me and I lay on the grass. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike looked at me, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. "I know. But I don't know how to stop," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't want to hurt anyone, but I can't let you go." "You're not the only one struggling with this," he said, his voice breaking. "But if we're going to stop, we have to do it now, before it's too late." I nodded, the tears spilling over as I looked at him, memorizing every detail of his face. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "So am I," he said, his voice raw with emotion. And with that, we stood, the unspoken goodbye lingering between us as we walked away in opposite directions, leaving behind a love that could never be. In the days that followed my last meeting with Mike, life felt heavier. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me, each room echoing with reminders of my betrayal. I told myself that walking away from Mike was the right thing to do, that I needed to focus on repairing what was left of my marriage, but the ache in my chest refused to fade. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice, felt his touch. Sam came home a week later, his arrival marked by the usual flurry of suitcases and phone calls. He hugged me briefly, distracted as always, his mind already halfway back to the office. I watched him move around the house, barking orders into his phone, and barely acknowledging my presence. It was as if he had returned physically, but left his heart somewhere else entirely. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I forced myself to make conversation. "How was the trip?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "Exhausting," he replied, not looking up from his plate. "But productive. The client's happy, and that's what matters." I nodded, taking a sip of water to wash down the bitterness rising in my throat. "You've been working so hard lately," I said, trying to bridge the gap between us. "Maybe we should plan a weekend away, just the two of us." He looked at me then, his brow furrowed, as if the suggestion caught him off guard. "I don't know, Rachel. Things are really busy right now. Maybe in a few months." I forced a smile, nodding as if I understood, but inside a piece of me broke. A few months, that was always the answer. Always later. Never now. The next morning, I decided to go for a walk, desperate to clear my head. The crisp autumn air stung my cheeks as I made my way through the park, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot providing a temporary distraction from my thoughts. I told myself I was just out for exercise, but deep down, I knew I was hoping to see him. And there he was. Mike stood near the edge of the pond, skipping stones across the water. He didn't notice me at first, his focus on the ripples spreading out across the surface. For a moment, I considered turning around and leaving before he saw me. But my feet betrayed me, carrying me closer until I was standing a few feet away. "Hi," I said softly. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it softened into something else. "Hi," he whispered. We stood there in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between us as palpable as ever. Finally, he spoke. "I didn't think I'd see you again." I wasn't sure if I should come," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I needed to." "To what?" he asked, stepping closer, to see if it still feels the same. I didn't answer, but the look in my eyes must have given me away. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Rachel, we can't keep doing this. It's not fair. To Sam, to us." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." Jake didn't respond, his eyes half closed. Mike closed the distance between us, his hands gently gripping my arms. "Neither can I," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "But this, it's tearing you apart. And it's killing me to see you like this." I looked up at him, my eyes pleading. "Then what do we do?" He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "We have to decide what we want, all of it, not just the parts that feel good. Because if we keep going like this, we'll destroy everything." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as Sam slept soundly beside me. Mike's words echoed in my mind, their truth cutting through the fog of my emotions. He was right. We couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between desire and guilt. But the thought of letting him go for good felt like losing a part of myself. The next morning, I decided to confront Sam. If there was any chance of saving our marriage, I needed to be honest about how I was feeling. I found him in his office, his laptop open and papers scattered across the desk. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He looked up, surprised by the seriousness in my tone. "Sure. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "I've been feeling distant lately. From you. From us." Sam frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Distant? What do you mean?" "I mean that I feel like we've been drifting apart," I said, my voice trembling. "You're always working, always away. And I'm here, trying to hold everything together, but it feels like I'm doing it alone." He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I didn't realize you felt that way," he said finally. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I'm saying it now," I replied, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "But it's not just about you being gone. It's about how we've stopped trying. We don't talk, we don't connect, it's like we're just going through the motions." Sam's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he was going to argue. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he admitted. "I've been so focused on work that I haven't been paying attention to us. I'm sorry, Rachel. I never wanted to make you feel this way." His apology caught me off guard, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. But it was quickly extinguished by the weight of my secret. Could we really rebuild what we had if he didn't know the full truth? "No. I need to ask you something," Sam said suddenly, his voice cutting through my thoughts. "Are you happy? With me?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words caught in my throat. Was I happy? Or was I just comfortable, clinging to the familiarity of a life that no longer fulfilled me? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't know anymore." Sam's face fell, and the sight of his pain sent a pang of guilt through me. But I couldn't lie to him, not about this. "We can fix this," he said, his voice determined. "We'll make time for each other. I'll cut back on work. Whatever it takes." I nodded, but the doubt lingered. Could we really fix something that had been broken for so long? Or was it too late? The days that followed were filled with small, tentative efforts to rebuild our connection. Sam started coming home earlier, and we spent more time together, trying to rekindle the spark that had once defined our relationship. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. And then, one evening, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, there was a knock on the door. My heart raced as I opened it, finding Mike standing there, his expression conflicted. It spelled 911, Star Trek Channel 14, unexpectedly. "I couldn't stay away," he said simply. I stared at him, my resolve crumbling. I knew I was standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything, and for the first time I wasn't sure which path to take. The air between Mike and me crackled with tension as he stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and vulnerable. I gripped the edge of the door, my heart pounding in my chest as if trying to escape the inevitable. His presence was a storm, one I both feared and craved. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling despite my attempt at firmness. "I know," he replied, his tone soft but resolute, "but I couldn't stay away." I glanced over my shoulder, making sure Sam wasn't in earshot. He was in the living room, engrossed in a television program. I turned back to Mike, lowering my voice. "Mike, I told you. This has to stop. We can't keep doing this." "Then tell me you don't feel anything," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. Tell me this hasn't been keeping you up at night, that it doesn't haunt you the way it haunts me. I opened my mouth to protest, but the words refused to come, because he was right. I hadn't slept, hadn't stopped thinking about the kiss, about him. The weight of his gaze was unbearable, and I felt my resolve crumbling. Please, Mike, I whispered, desperation creeping into my tone. Just go. But he didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, crossing the threshold into the house. The sound of his boots on the hardwood floor felt like a warning bell, yet I didn't stop him. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch sealing us in together. I can't go, Rachel, he said, his voice breaking. Not without knowing, not without hearing you say it. Say what? I asked, my throat dry. That you don't feel the same, he said, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hope. Because if you don't, I'll walk out of here right now and never come back. But if you do, Mike, Sam's voice called from the living room, cutting through the moment like a knife. Who's at the door? Panic surged through me. I stepped back, creating distance between Mike and me, and turned to call out. It's Mike. He just stopped by to drop something off. There was a pause, and I held my breath, waiting. Then Sam's voice came again, casual and unconcerned. All right. Tell him I said hi. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly, but the reprieve was short-lived. Mike stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt that familiar jolt of electricity. Tell me what you want, Rachel, he murmured, his voice low and pleading. I don't know, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I don't know what I want anymore. He cupped my face in his hands, his touch gentle yet grounding. Yes, you do. You just don't want to admit it. Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps approached. I stepped back quickly, putting distance between us just as Sam appeared in the hallway. He looked at the two of us, his expression casual but slightly curious. Hey, Mike, he said, nodding. Didn't know you'd be stopping by. Just thought I'd check in, Mike replied smoothly, his voice calm and even. See how you two are doing. Well, we're good, Sam said, his tone light. He glanced at me, then back at Mike. Why don't you stay for dinner? We've got plenty. My heart sank. The last thing I needed was the two of them sitting across from each other at the table, the weight of my secret suffocating me. But before I could object, Mike nodded. Sure, he said, his eyes briefly meeting mine. I'd like that. The dinner table felt like a battleground, every glance and word loaded with tension. Sam chatted casually, oblivious to the undercurrent running between Mike and me. I forced myself to smile and nod, my hands trembling slightly as I passed the dishes. So, Mike, Sam said, leaning back in his chair, you been seeing anyone lately? Mike hesitated, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. His eyes flickered to me before he replied. Not really. Haven't found the right person. Maybe you're not looking hard enough, Sam joked, chuckling. You've got to put yourself out there, man. Can't sit around waiting for love to fall into your lap. Mike forced a laugh, but the sound was hollow. Yeah, maybe you're right. I stared at my plate, unable to look at either of them. Every word felt like a dagger, each laugh a reminder of the tangled mess I had created. The walls of the house seemed to close in on me, the air growing heavier with every passing second. After dinner, Sam excused himself to make a phone call, leaving Mike and me alone in the kitchen. I busied myself with cleaning up, my back to him as I scrubbed at an already clean plate. I stood there. You didn't have to stay, I said, my voice tight. Why did you? Because I couldn't leave you like that, he replied softly. Not when I can see how much this is tearing you apart. I turned to face him, tears brimming in my eyes. You being here isn't helping, Mike. It's making everything worse. Then tell me to leave, he said, stepping closer. Tell me you never want to see me again, and I'll go. But don't push me away, because you're scared. I am scared, I admitted, my voice breaking. Scared of losing Sam. Scared of losing you. Scared of what this means. Mike reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It means you're human. It means you want to be loved, to be seen. And there's nothing wrong with that. Before I could respond, Sam reappeared in the doorway, his phone in hand. Everything okay in here? He asked, his tone light but curious. I quickly pulled my hand away, forcing a smile. Yeah, everything's fine, just finishing up. Sam nodded, seemingly satisfied, and turned to Mike. You staying long? No, Mike said quickly, his voice steady. I was just about to head out. As he left, he glanced back at me one last time, his eyes filled with a mix of longing and sorrow. The door closed behind him, and I was left standing in the kitchen, my heart torn between two impossible choices. That night, as I lay in bed next to Sam, the weight of my decisions pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I had thought I could control this, that I could keep my feelings for Mike hidden, but the truth was, they were already spilling over, threatening to drown everything in their path. I turned to look at Sam, his face peaceful in sleep. He had no idea how fragile our life together had become, how close it was to shattering. And the worst part was, I didn't know if I had the strength to save it, or if I even wanted to. The sound of rain tapping against the window lulled me into a restless sleep, my dreams haunted by the echoes of Mike's voice and the unspoken truths between us. When morning came, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to give. And soon, the days after that dinner stretched on like an endless fog. Every interaction with Sam felt heavier, as though a part of me was screaming to tell him the truth, while another part was desperate to bury it. My mind raced constantly. What would happen if he found out? What would Mike do if I ended things for good? Could I even end things for good? Sam, oblivious to the chaos roiling inside me, seemed to be making an effort. He began coming home earlier, asking about my day, even suggesting we spend a weekend in the mountains together. These were gestures I had longed for not long ago, but now they felt hollow, like they had come too late. One evening, Sam surprised me by setting the table with candles and cooking dinner. The smell of roasted chicken wafted through the house, and he looked genuinely proud as he brought out the dishes. Thought we could use a quiet night, he said, pulling out a chair for me. That's thoughtful, I said, sitting down and forcing a smile. The guilt gnawed at me like a restless beast. I didn't deserve this kindness, not after everything I had done. As we ate, Sam started talking about a promotion he had been offered. It's a big opportunity, he said, leaning forward, his eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. But it would mean more travel, at least for the first year. My stomach sank. More travel, more nights alone, more chances for everything to spiral further out of control. What do you think? He asked, his tone hopeful. I mean, it's not just about me. I want this to work for both of us. Both of us? The irony wasn't lost on me. Here he was, trying to include me in a decision after years of making them on his own. And now it felt too late. "I think you should do what makes you happy," I said, my voice quiet. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The gesture was warm, reassuring, but it only deepened my shame. "I want to make you happy, Rachel. I know I haven't been around as much as I should have, but I'm trying." I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. His sincerity cut through me like a knife, leaving me raw and exposed. The next day, I found myself standing outside Mike's house. I had told myself I was just going for a drive to clear my head. But somehow I ended up here, my heart pounding as I stared at the door. Before I could lose my nerve, I knocked. Mike opened the door, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer. "Rachel," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "I didn't think I'd come," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He led me to the living room and we sat on the couch, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I broke the quiet. "Sam's trying," I said, my voice trembling. "He's making an effort." Louis smiled, revealing his wrinkled teeth. "That's good," Mike said, though his tone was guarded. "It's what you wanted, isn't it?" "I don't know what I want anymore," I confessed, tears brimming in my eyes. "I feel like I'm drowning, like I can't breathe. And when I'm with you, you feel alive," he finished, his gaze piercing, "because I feel the same." I looked away, my tears spilling over. "This isn't fair to anyone, Mike. Not to you, not to Sam, and not to me. I don't know how to fix this." He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. "You have to choose, Rachel. You can't keep living in between. It's not fair to you either." The truth of his words settled over me like a weight. I knew he was right. I couldn't keep holding on to both of them, trying to navigate a path that left me torn in two. "Do you love him?" Mike asked suddenly, his voice soft but unwavering. The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Did I love Sam? Or had I just been clinging to the memory of what we used to be, hoping it would somehow come back? The silence stretched on, and Mike's expression darkened. "You don't have to answer," he said, his voice tinged with resignation. "I think I already know. I do love him," I said finally, the words spilling out in a rush. "But it's not the same. I don't know if it's enough." Mike nodded, his jaw tightening as he processed my answer. "Then you have to figure out what you want, Rachel. And if it's not me, I'll step back. But if it is, you have to let him go." That night, I lay awake in bed, Sam's steady breathing beside me, a stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. My thoughts churned endlessly, replaying Mike's words, Sam's gestures, and my own growing confusion. The weight of the choice before me felt unbearable. In the end, I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. The next morning, as Sam was getting ready for work, I sat him down at the kitchen table. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. He frowned, setting down his coffee mug. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, the words catching in my throat. "I haven't been honest with you about how I've been feeling, about a lot of things." His expression shifted to concern, then to something darker as realization began to dawn. "Rachel, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm not happy," I said, tears spilling over. "And I don't think I have been for a long time." Sam leaned back in his chair, his face pale. Is there someone else?" The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't bring myself to lie, but the truth felt like a blade poised to strike. Finally, I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. He let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "How long?" "Not long," I said quickly, desperate to soften the blow. "And it's not what you think. It's not about him. It's about us. About how disconnected we've been." Sam stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen as he ran a hand through his hair. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "After everything. After all the years we'd been together." "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, my voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," he snapped, his voice rising. "And now what? You're just going to walk away, throw everything we've built away what? For him?" "I don't know," I admitted, the tears streaming down my face. "But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not." Sam stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping as the anger drained from his face. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with pain. "I thought we were in this together, Rachel. I thought we were stronger than this." Beside that sleepy-eyed thing still had a sense of derangement. "So did I whispered, my voice trembling. "But somewhere along the way we lost each other, and I don't know how to find our way back." The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of our shattered marriage hanging between us. Finally, Sam nodded, his expression resigned. "If this is what you want," he said, his voice hollow, "then I won't stop you. But I need you to be sure, Rachel, because once you walk out that door, there's no coming back." I stared at him, my heart breaking into pieces. The house felt empty after our conversation, the weight of Sam's words lingering in the air like a ghost. I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the empty coffee mug in front of me, the remnants of my tears drying on my cheeks. Sam had left for work without another word, his silence a stark contrast to the storm of emotions raging inside me. I had begged for honesty in our marriage, but now that it was here, it felt unbearable. He knew, and there was no turning back. I had destroyed the fragile balance we had maintained for years, and now I was left standing in the rubble of our life together, unsure of what to do next. The next day, I woke to find the bed beside me empty. Sam hadn't come home the night before. My phone buzzed with a message from him, short and to the point. "I need some time to think." I couldn't blame him. I needed time to think too. But instead of clarity, my thoughts felt like a tangled web, each thread pulling me in a different direction. I found myself driving to the park, hoping the crisp air and quiet surroundings would help me make sense of it all. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, a stark reminder that change was inevitable, whether I was ready for it or not. As I walked along the familiar path, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Mike. "Mike, can we talk?" I hesitated, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to close this chapter for good and focus on salvaging what was left of my marriage. But another part of me, the part that had brought me to this moment, couldn't let him go. "Me? Where?" His response was immediate. "Mike. My place." I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the phone heavy in my hand. Finally, I typed a reply. "Me. I'm on my way." I said. Mike's house felt different this time, quieter, more somber. He opened the door before I could knock, stepping aside to let me in. His expression was serious, his usual confidence replaced by something softer, almost hesitant. "Thanks for coming," he said, closing the door behind me. "I'm not sure why I did," I admitted, folding my arms across my chest. "Everything's a mess, Mike." "I know," he said, motioning for me to sit. I chose the couch, the same spot where so much had begun, and he sat across from me, leaving a deliberate space between us. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, he spoke. "How's Sam?" "He's—" I paused, searching for the right words. "He's hurt and confused." I told him everything. As I sang, I saw Kane raise his hand, calling my name. Mike's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Everything?" "Not about you," I clarified quickly. "Just about how I've been feeling. About how distant we've been." I sighed. Mike nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And what did he say?" "He said he wants to make it work," I said, my voice cracking. "But I don't know if I can." "Why not?" Mike asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Because part of me doesn't want to," I admitted, tears welling up in my eyes. "Part of me feels like it's too late, like we've lost too much to ever get it back." "And the other part?" he asked, leaning forward. "The other part feels guilty for even thinking that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sam deserves better than this. Better than me." Mike shook his head, his gaze intense. "Don't say that. You deserve happiness, Rachel. You deserve to be with someone who sees you, who loves you the way you need to be loved." "Maybe," I said, wiping at my tears. "But does that give me the right to hurt him, to throw away everything we've built?" "It's not about throwing it away," Mike said, his voice steady. "It's about being honest with yourself. If you stay with him out of guilt, you'll both end up miserable. You have to figure out what you really want." "What if I don't know what I want?" I asked, my voice breaking. "What if I'm too scared to choose?" Mike reached out, his hand covering mine. "Then you take it one step at a time. But whatever you do, Rachel, do it for the right reasons, not out of fear or obligation. Do it because it's what's best for you." "Yeah." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I looked at him, my heart aching with the weight of everything I felt for him and everything I stood to lose. "I need time," I said finally, pulling my hand away. "I need to figure this out on my own." Mike nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and sadness. "I'll be here, Rachel. No matter what you decide, I'll be here." The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I threw myself into work, into routines, anything to distract myself from the storm inside me. Sam stayed away, giving me the space I needed, but his absence was like a gaping wound. I missed him, and yet I didn't know if missing him was enough. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the door opened and Sam walked in. He looked tired, his face drawn, but there was a determination in his eyes that sent a shiver through me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm. I nodded, my heart pounding as I motioned for him to sit. He chose the armchair across from me, keeping the distance between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out like a chasm. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice quiet, "about us, about everything." "And?" I asked, bracing myself. "And I realized something," he said, meeting my gaze. "I've been so focused on my career, on providing for us, that I forgot what I was supposed to be providing for. I forgot about you. His words hit me like a wave, and tears filled my eyes. "Sam." "No, let me finish," he said, holding up a hand. "I know I've messed up. I know I've hurt you, and I hate that. But I also know that I love you, Rachel. I don't want to lose you." I stared at him, my emotions warring inside me. "Sam, I don't know if love is enough. We've drifted so far apart. I don't even know if we can find our way back." "Maybe we can't," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I want to try. Don't you?" His question hung in the air, and I felt the weight of my decision pressing down on me. Could I let go of the past and rebuild what we had? Or was it time to walk away and start over? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I have it in me to try." Sam nodded, his expression pained but resigned. "Then maybe that's our answer." The room fell silent, the finality of his words sinking in. For the first time I realized that this might truly be the end, and despite everything, the thought broke my heart. The house felt colder after Sam left that night, the silence heavier than it had ever been. I sat on the couch, staring at the shadows cast by the dim light in the corner of the room. My mind was a whirlpool of memories and regrets, pulling me deeper into a sea of uncertainty. The man I had built a life with was slipping through my fingers, and part of me didn't know if I had the strength or the desire to hold on. The next morning, I woke to an empty bed, my mind still clouded from a restless sleep. Sam had texted me, "I'll be staying at a hotel for a few days. Take the time you need." His words were kind, even in the face of my betrayal, and that kindness cut me deeper than any anger ever could. I spent the day wandering the house, my thoughts bouncing between what had been and what might come next. Each room held memories, some joyful, some bittersweet, and others that felt like they belonged to another life entirely. By the time evening came, I felt drained, the weight of my indecision pressing down on me like a heavy shroud. And then the doorbell rang. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but something compelled me to move, to answer. When I opened the door, Mike was standing there, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his expression a mix of hesitation and determination. "I know I shouldn't be here," he began, his voice low, "but I couldn't stay away." "Mike," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "this isn't a good time." "I know," he said again, stepping forward just enough that the porch light illuminated his face. "But I need to know. I need to know if you're still holding on to us or if I need to let you go." His words hit me like a wave, and I felt the tears welling up in my eyes. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice cracking. "I don't know anything anymore." He whispered, "It's gonna be okay." Mike stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently cup my face. "Then let me remind you," he said softly, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down my cheek. "Let me remind you of what we have, of what we could be." His lips were on mine before I could respond, and the kiss was like a spark in the darkness, reigniting all the emotions I had tried so hard to bury. For a moment, I let myself get lost in him, in the connection that had drawn us together despite everything. But as the kiss deepened, the weight of reality came crashing down. "Oh, Jillian." I pulled away, my breath ragged as I stepped back. "I can't," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't do this, Mike. Not like this." "Why not?" he asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "Because of Sam? Because of guilt or because you're scared? All of it, I said, tears streaming down my face. Because no matter what I choose, someone gets hurt, and I don't know if I can live with that. Mike nodded slowly, his expression filled with pain but also understanding. Then you need to figure out what you can live with, Rachel, because you can't keep living like this. None of us can. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the doorway, my heart shattering all over again. The next few days passed in a haze. Sam stayed away, his absence both a relief and a reminder of everything I was losing. Mike didn't reach out, giving me the space I had said I needed. And yet, the silence from both of them felt deafening, each moment alone magnifying the emptiness inside me. I spent hours replaying every conversation, every kiss, every moment that had brought me to this point. I thought about the life I had built with Sam, the love we had once shared, and the promises we had made. I thought about Mike, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years, the connection that had taken me by surprise and consumed me. And then I thought about myself, about the woman I had become and the woman I wanted to be. For so long, I had defined myself by the roles I played, wife, partner, supporter. But somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of who I was outside of those roles. Now, standing at this crossroads, I realized I couldn't make a choice for Sam or Mike. I had to make it for me. When I finally called Sam, my hands were trembling as I held the phone to my ear. He answered on the second ring, his voice cautious but hopeful. "Rachel, can you come home?" I asked, my voice unsteady. "We need to talk." "Of course," he said immediately. "I'll be there soon." I hung up and sat on the couch, waiting for the sound of his car in the driveway. When he arrived, he looked tired, as though the past few days had aged him. He sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. "I've made my decision," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, bracing himself. "Okay." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I love you, Sam. I always have. But we've been drifting apart for so long, and I don't know if we can find our way back to each other." His face fell, the pain in his eyes cutting through me like a knife. "So that's it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You're leaving?" I think it's what we both need," I said, tears streaming down my face. "We've been holding on to what we used to be, but it's not who we are anymore, and maybe that's okay." Sam looked down, his shoulders slumping as he processed my words. When he looked up again, his eyes were red, but there was a flicker of understanding there. "If this is what you need, Rachel, I'll let you go. But I want you to know that I still love you, and I always will." "I love you too," I said, my voice breaking, "and I'm so sorry." We sat there in silence, the weight of goodbye settling over us like a heavy blanket. When Sam finally stood to leave, he hesitated, looking back at me one last time. "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "You too," I whispered, and then he was gone. The next day I called Mike. He answered on the first ring, his voice filled with both hope and apprehension. "Rachel, I've made my decision," I said, my voice steady. "And?" he asked, his breath catching. "I need to be alone for a while," I said, tears filling my eyes. "I need to figure out who I am before I can be with anyone else." There was a long pause, and then Mike exhaled softly. "I understand, and I'll be here, Rachel. If you ever change your mind, I'll be here." Thank you, I said, my voice breaking, for everything. As I hung up, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't choosing out of guilt or obligation. I was choosing for me, joy, and for the first time, I felt free.